I raised a question last time, which we might examine in more detail now. Why do we bother with proletarian literature? Particularly if it's true, as I've suggested, that the literature largely, overwhelmingly, was a failure. I tried to indicate that I am not in any sense a literary historian. If it were a matter simply of historical interest, I would not be pursuing this subject. I'm concerned, as someone who is himself primarily a writer of fiction, with what is happening in the world of fiction currently, what the potentialities are, what the new trends may be. They relate quite specifically to my own work, but in a broader sense, I'm interested in what more vital and younger writers may be doing, or may be getting around to doing. And this is the only sense in which I'm interested in proletarian literature. Because as I tried to suggest, I see evidence that an attempt is going to be made again, and is indeed beginning to be made, to write a literature focused primarily on those people who have traditionally been overlooked in literature. The bottom dogs, the peripheral people, those, the forgotten, the overlooked, which I think reflects the ferment coming up from those areas in our times. An interesting point. Writers, artists in general, have prided themselves on being avant-garde. In other words, on being leaders and pace setters. It more often than not turns out the other way around. It turns out enough times to be worth noting that important, enormous undercurrents begin to move in the very heart of society, and that only when they become strikingly obvious, too important, too overwhelming to be ignored, do artists begin to pay attention to them and begin ultimately to make them their subject matter. Wouldn't you say that in terms of abstract logic, a literature dealing somehow with the proletariat would certainly have been undertaken once again somewhere in the 1950s, considering what's been happening socially, economically, in a general cultural sense. Yet only now, in 1969, do I see the beginnings of such an interest amongst writers. I should give you more evidence to that effect. The last time I mentioned two new novels being published, one published within the past month, the other just now appearing, which conform, I think, in all basic respects to the definition of proletarian literature. And by the way, we'll get around to discussing that definition in detail. I mentioned Leonard Gardner's first novel, Fat City, about Skid Row life in Stockton. And I mentioned Bill Herrick's Hermanos, the Spanish word for brothers, the story, an autobiographical novel about growing up in the communist movement in New York, being recruited to serve in the Abraham Lincoln Battalion in the Spanish Civil War, breaking with the communist movement, remaining, however, a revolutionary, and the subsequent problems in such a disordered, disjointed life. Again, written entirely in a proletarian spirit and from the background of proletarian experience. But two novels do not a trend make. Is anything else happening? Well, I think I indicated that in the writing class seminar I've been doing here on campus the last 3 years, there has been enough indication to be noted that people coming out of the proletariat, having the opportunity to get into an area of higher education, are beginning to confront their backgrounds rather than to avoid them as they climb into the middle class, to consider their origins without shame, rather with interest, and to begin actually to write about them. That's happened often enough in my class to make me think something new may be happening, because 10 or 15 years ago, I suspect in any writing class, any campus of any size, those people who came out of bottom dog origins would not have dwelt upon their pasts, would rather have reached for materials that seemed to be the acknowledged and accepted materials of fiction. I think that may be new. Also, one sees in proletarian or bottom dog minority areas, in ghettos and barrios, efforts toward an expression in literary form, such as we did not have before this decade or even before 1965. A press begins to emerge from the ghetto and from the barrio. In East Los Angeles, you have La Raza, you have Consafos, and other publications. In Watts, you have the Watts Workshop, which has stimulated a lot of young people who had never attempted to deal with words before, to write, and to write really about themselves. And out of this has come a volume called From These Ashes, an anthology of writings from people in the Watts Workshop. You have beyond that recent books of considerable interest and sometimes high literary merit from people who at least come out of proletarian origins, although they may be upward bound or outward bound. I'm talking, for example, about Claude Brown, whose Man-Child in a Promised Land, autobiographical and yet quite novelistic, is a work of special literary value. Claude Brown, I don't think, remains in the ghetto. I believe after writing this book, he went on to law school. What he intends to do with himself, I don't know. But the one book he did produce about growing up in Harlem is close to first-rate literature, and definitely proletarian. Claude Brown may therefore be considered upward bound, and what relationship he will retain with his community is a matter of considerable interest. We don't know the answer yet, and possibly he doesn't. There are also the outward bound, and of course the first person who comes to mind is Eldridge Cleaver, who I think, despite considerable naivete in his literary values, is nevertheless a natural-born writer. I think many passages in Soul on Ice have an intense novelistic quality, and now there's evidence that he's going to pursue the novelistic form further. You may have noticed, those of you who follow Ramparts, that in the last issue they published an excerpt of a work he was engaged in while in the penitentiary, having to do with his early experiences in the ghetto, a period in which he ran not with blacks but with Chicanos. And this is almost completely novelistic. And again, some of it extremely interesting writing. Beyond the works that begin to appear here and there that conform to our category, there's something else which impresses me. There is a continuing and expanding thirst for documentary material about the life of the poor, the subcultures of the poor. And I'll give you two examples. You may be familiar with James Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Now, this was actually written in the 1930s. It came about when Agee was assigned by Fortune magazine. He then and for years after worked for Time, Life, and Fortune. Was assigned to travel in the South and write a documentary about the lives of sharecroppers and tenant farmers and so on. He was accompanied by a very skillful photographer named Walker Evans. He began this as a routine, although intensely interesting, magazine assignment. He became so engrossed in the experience that he produced not simply a magazine article, but a book-length manuscript, very complicated in form, attempting to arrive at a poetic structure to contain and give meaning to the experiential materials that he got firsthand. This work rather scared the editors of Fortune magazine. It went a little beyond what they had hoped for, and they never did publish it. But Agee then went on and published it as a book, and it has become a minor classic as an example of documentary journalism done from really close up. Now, the interesting point about this book, aside from the way it came into existence, is that there has been a continuing interest in it. People reach for it year after year. It remains in print. It somehow has an authenticity, a first-handedness about it that very few written words do in connection with what life is like at the bottom or way at the outside. I don't know what the sales figures are in this book, but I would assume that it sells quite a few thousands every year. Beyond this, however, there is a newcomer to the field of such social documentation. Oscar Lewis, the sociologist, who is specialized in doing documentaries as a trained sociologist on the lives of the poor in many different areas. I don't think so far he's dealt with anything in the United States, but 2 or 3 of his books, Children of Sanchez and 5 Families, are documentaries about urban slum life in Mexico City and bottom-level rural life in Mexico. In addition, he's done a similar job on Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. And he's done one on Indian. Was it American Indian? No, India. India, that's right, yes. Now, it's interesting to watch the response. Almost all of his books have been bestsellers. One was even bought for the movies. They haven't figured out how to make a movie of it yet. That's 5 Families. But nonetheless, there even is movie interest. And I think I told you last time that both of the Proletarian novels published this month have been bought for movies before publication. You can well imagine that as recently as 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, no movie people would touch such materials. Now, I am not going to say to you that movie makers are the foremost trend spotters of our times, but they are interested in broad audiences, and they do their best to determine what it is that broad audiences will want. So I assume it is now their premise that there is a mass market for movies about the proletariat and the slum proletariat and so on, and even about situations involving revolutionary politics, such as the Spanish Civil War, which did not exist in the recent past, or at least they thought it didn't exist. I think that's enough evidence to suggest that, while there are no guarantees, nobody really can predict with accuracy, it's a certain probability that there's going to be more such literature forthcoming in the next few years. Fortunately, you and I will not be in communication by the time we discover whether I'm right or wrong. It probably will take 10 years or so. But I think I'm right. We should establish that we've selected one art form from a broad phenomenon. Actually, there have been attempts made over the past decades, and most particularly in the 30s, to build not just a proletarian novel, but in a broader sense, a whole proletarian literature, and in a broader sense still, a whole proletarian culture. The 30s were distinguished by some 100 proletarian novels. But there also was considerable production of proletarian poetry, proletarian plays. Broadway was perhaps overwhelmed by proletarianism for a period of some years. The plays of Clifford Odets, Albert Maltz, George Sklar, John Howard Lawson, and on and on and on, were the plays that received the most attention. Or Irwin Shaw, the plays that received the most attention on Broadway. And they all dealt with proletarianism one way or another. And some of them were simple, straight-out, revolutionary statements. The novel was perhaps the area in which the most sustained and most intense effort was made to deal with proletarian material. And so is the area that it seems to me is most worth focusing on. But along the way we'll talk about, not so much about the poetry because it was the least significant of the efforts, but we'll talk occasionally about the plays that were coming out at that time as well.
Do you offer any reason as for the decline of this type of a novel, and then some 20 years later, the rise of it?
I think the first reason that has to be considered is a political one.
What?
The political one. We're dealing with an area in which literature confronts politics, and in which indeed literature is often suggested by, stimulated by, and at times even dictated by political concerns. Concerns that sometimes reach an obsessive point. I think that the proletarian novel declined after 1940, or really at the end of the 30s. Not simply because it was done so badly, because God knows in literary history we have a lot of terrible forms that have endured decade after decade, but because the political climate no longer stimulated it, and no longer provided an audience for it. And I'm talking about a series of political events that left the politically mobilized writers of the 30s in dismay, in disarray, and in despair, which caused them to retreat into the, in quotes, ivory tower, return to the more traditional and safer occupations of writers, to cut themselves off from social and political concerns. I'm talking about a series of events starting with the Moscow trials, which really were initiated in 1934, went down through 1937-38. We'll come back and deal with these matters in more detail because they have very centrally to do with the agonies of writers of those times. Starting with the Moscow trials, going through the Spanish Civil War and the ultimate defeat of the Loyalists, and having a great deal to do with the role of the official Communist Party in that struggle. Going beyond to the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and finally to the outbreak of war. We're going to find that the writers who were mobilized politically in the 30s, almost entirely, very few exceptions, grouped themselves around the Communist Party in this country and elsewhere. There were important and complicated political battles as one or another of them became disenchanted either with the politics of that party or with the effects of its specific actions out in the public arena. Debates sometimes very bitter, very vehement, and sometimes truly, in a physical sense, very violent, between those who drifted away from the official communist movement, pointing out one event after another that was disastrous from the point of view of the working class, that they thought the Communist Party was responsible for, and now we're talking about Moscow trials and Spanish Civil War and so on. Between those people on the one hand, and I don't have to remain this abstract, I'm talking about John Dos Passos, James T. Farrell, and Edmund Wilson, and quite a few others who were at the outset, in the initial phase of proletarianism, completely caught up in it, and then, without relinquishing their radicalism, began to depart from the specific politics of the Communist Party, which brought them into direct conflict with those many artists and writers who chose to remain in the official orbit of the official Communist Party. Ideological conflict began to dominate the cultural scene. With each new disaster, starting with the trials, Moscow trials, and going through this defeat in the Spanish Civil War, and on through the Nazi-Soviet pact, more people fell by the wayside. And you know, it's interesting that when the McCarthy Committee was at its height in Washington in the early 1950s, creating a Red Scare which terrorized everybody of any liberal, not to mention left persuasion, resulting, for example, in the passage of the whole loyalty oath business in the University of California, which you may have heard Angela Davis discussing. At that time, the McCarthy Committee set up certain standards for judging how acceptable an intellectual with a radical past might be in these days. And they set up a calendar of events during the 1930s. And the judgment was, the effort was to determine at which point, with which event, did a given leftist or revolutionary intellectual drop away from politics, or at least from the Communist Party. Anybody who dropped away from the period of the Moscow trials up through the Nazi-Soviet pact was considered as just possible for social reclamation, and might not be persecuted and prosecuted all down the line if he applied for an academic post or a government post. Anybody who stayed beyond the Nazi-Soviet pact was considered to be subversive in his germ cells and thoroughly beyond the pale, and deserving to be whipped in public. And the whippings took place in various forms. But the point is, and as a matter of fact, people who left revolutionary politics in the latter years of the 30s went in many different directions. Some became anarcho-communists, freelance revolutionaries without a homeland, and accomplishing no revolutions, obviously, but retaining some sense of disgust, nausea with the state of affairs in the world, and wanting some kind of totally radical alteration of it. But paralyzed because there were no political instruments that they found they could associate themselves with, as they had for a time with the Communist Party in the early part of the 30s. But not all of them remained on the left side of things. John Dos Passos, over a period of some years, after 20 years as a revolutionary of sorts, always a little trouble about organization, always too much the anarchist to feel at ease in a tightly cohesive, well-organized, centralized group. But all the same, remaining a revolutionary for some 20 years, he started writing revolutionary novels right after the First World War, based on his own experiences in the war, and came into the proletarian movement, was one of the first into it, and his works were considered to be guidelines for the developing proletarianism of the 30s. Was one of the first to depart from left-wing politics of the time, and wound up, despite his 20 years of radicalism, wound up as a Hoover Republican, which he is to this day. And there's a certain peculiar logic which you can follow there. His essential rebellious spirit was anarchistic, which led him to feel that any structural strictures on the behavior of the individual was somehow foul and to be fought against. for a while he didn't fight too strongly against the organization of the Communist Party, but he never felt at ease with it. The final ideology he came to was that all government is evil, all controls are evil, all social structures are evil, therefore the less structurizing the better. And that's precisely the position of Hoover Republicanism, or of Goldwater Republicanism. Interesting phenomenon has happened in the last year. You may have noticed that a guy named Carl Hess, a young guy, who wrote, he's quite brilliant as a writer, was a magazine writer, on Fortune magazine, I think, who wrote all the speeches for Goldwater during his ill-fated presidential campaign, was thoroughly a Goldwater Republican, has in the last year broken with Goldwater and joined the SDS. And now, you see, he's indicating that he's being consistent in his ideology. He's saying Goldwater is the coward and not fighting for what he truly believes in. You may have read some of his articles in Ramparts, articles addressed to Goldwater, saying, I'm out here fighting for what you pretend to believe in. And I think there is a consistency. So in other words, the process can go either way. John Dos Passos can become a Republican, Carl Hess can become a SDS, whatever you want to call it. But by the time, even allowing for all of the frictions and really violent conflicts developed by the politics of the 30s, which really broke up what was originally a strong, remarkably strong united front of artists, by the time the war began, World War II, this whole thing was in a shambles, because obviously what happened was that a lot of uneasy fellow travelers, if you know that phrase from the days of the 1930s, McCarthy used it considerably in his investigations, people who didn't officially join the Communist Party, but traveled along with it and participated in the cultural front organizations generated by the Communist Party. These people never felt thoroughly at home with a position that led them entirely outside of the establishment. And in a sense, they rather welcomed the coming of World War II because it allowed them to become patriots again and abolished a conflict, an internal conflict that it was not easy for them to live with. So that one large section of intellectuals simply said, thank God, they didn't say in so many words, but the spirit was, thank God we have at last a just war. So forget all about our previous positions, which were anti-war or Marxist revolutionary, Bolshevik Leninist, in the sense that the only way you participated in a war was to encourage a spirit of defeatism in all countries on the part of the working class and its allies, and to, if you ever were successful in that endeavor, to encourage a defeatist situation, you would then utilize it to overthrow the government and institute a dictatorship of the proletariat. That was the premise regarding policy toward war of everybody in the 1930s who was on the left side. But there came a complication. The war that developed very centrally involved Russia. So suddenly, two kinds of people were saying that this was a just war. Those who were happy to become patriots again, did not like being outside the establishment, far away from the center of things. And those who remained revolutionaries of the Communist Party persuasion, but who said, now we can't be anti-war because this war must be fought in the defense of the Soviet Union. Well, whatever justifications people use, whatever rationalizations, the net result was that everybody became a patriot. I'm sure most of you know that during all 4 years of World War II, the most patriotic organization in the United States was the Communist Party. Obviously, for a very good reason, because they felt that all politics, proletarian politics everywhere, had to be dictated by the interests of the Soviet Union, the worker state, and the guideline to other worker states that might be produced.
Are you saying that all the left, the people who weren't part of the party could even embrace, let's say, situations such as the encampment of all Japanese Americans in the United
Sure,
States?
sure. I'll tell you something else. This is a matter of historical record. There was an anti-subversion act passed at the beginning of the war called the Smith Act. The people who pressed hardest for its adoption were the people in the Communist Party. The Communist press conducted a really energetic campaign for the passage of that act. That act was never used against any member of the Communist Party. There was no reason to. Communists were volunteering for the armed forces. As I recall, the only time it was used after the war against the Rosenbergs. It was under the terms of that act that the Rosenbergs were executed as spies. During the war, I think it was used only once against 18 leaders of the small Trotskyite group. And this was done with the blessing of the Communist Party. The Communist Party press agitated for the trial of Trotskyites and other dissident communists as subversive because they didn't support the war effort of this country or of the Soviet Union. They retained a revolutionary Bolshevik-Leninist position regarding the war. These people were, these 18 Trotskyites, most of them involved in the Teamsters Union movement in Minnesota, which was then an unusual radical movement. These 18 people were found guilty and sent to federal penitentiary for 2 or 3 years, something of the sort. You can see that as the political climate changed and as patriotism became the order of the day for both kinds of intellectuals, those who fell away from the Communist Party and those who retained their loyalty to it, because of the shift in politics, there was very little occasion to write any revolutionary literature. Well, I think the answer to the question is, not only was the literature done so badly that it didn't deserve to be done any further, but the ideology of the people who produced the literature changed and caused them either to become spokesmen for official government policy, out of which I would suggest no literature of interest can be generated. You have only to examine the poetry of those eminent poets who became propagandists for the American war effort back in 1941 or so, to see what a low state of affairs is arrived at in literature when an establishment, the protection of an establishment is the keynote of the writing. I'm talking in particular about the poetry of Archibald MacLeish. Some people were simply so disgusted with the total collapse of the proletarian effort in the 30s that they retreated into pure art and forgot about social concerns. But I would say that the bulk of the intellectuals who were socially and politically active in the 30s became converted to some sort of orthodoxy. Whatever their reasons for supporting the war might have been, they supported it. And I would suggest that unless there is a considerable distance between the artist and the whole structure of authority of society, and a considerable tension between them as a result, you're not going to get a literature of interest. You can get a literature of apologetics, a literature of rationalization, but not a literature that stands so strongly against something massive that an intense emotion can be generated, out of which can come some extremely interesting writing. I think that's as far as we can take it at the moment. I suggest to you then that you